Okay, good afternoon to all. Welcome to this webinar series in Spatial Data Sciences. This series with Bruno Martins. I'm here on behalf of Professor Amilcar Soares. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here on time, but soon enough he will be with us to check out the presentation of Bruno. Bruno, thank you so much for to be available to do this webinar series and to participate on this webinar series. Bruno is going to present. He's going to make a presentation about interacting with models with remote sensing imagery through natural language. To make a brief presentation, Bruno Martins is an associate professor at Technique of the University of Lisbon. He's a researcher at the Human Language Technologies Lab of INESC ID and a member of the Lisbon Alice unit. He works on problems related to the general areas of information retrieval, text mining, and the geographical information sciences. Bruno has been involved in several research projects related to geospatial aspects in information access and retrieval, and he has accumulated a significant expertise in addressing challenges at the intersection of information retrieval and the geographical information sciences. And so this is one other project is in the field that he's going to present. Thank you once more, Bruno, to be here with us. Thank you, the audience, to be here also. And the floor is yours.
Okay. So hope you can hear me, and thanks again for the presentation. So this presentation here today is going to be relatively high level, right? So I'm going to be talking about some work that has been published, some work that is in the process of being published. There are a couple of documents that explain some of these things in more detail. So if you're interested, later on, you can reach out and I'll send you this. And also feel free to interrupt, okay? So during the presentation, if you have questions, let's try to make this a bit more interactive and feel free to ask, okay? Another thing is that this work that I'm presenting here today, well, in a way, it's still very preliminary and experimental, and I would say still far from any real practical applications. But the overall vision, I think it's quite interesting, okay? So, and we could, I guess, summarize these activities and see the goal of these activities as, well, in the end, hopefully having a sort of system like Google Earth, but through which you could interact in natural language, okay? So you could ask questions to this system about the contents of what is being shown, about the images that are being shown, or you could ask these systems to describe the images being shown, okay? All of this and making this interaction with natural language. That's the overall goal here. So doing this requires combinations of techniques from computer vision and natural language processing. And well, I'm going to kind of split these objectives into two separate tasks. One that has to do with generating descriptions for the images. I'll call this remote sensing image captioning. And the other that has to do with providing answers to natural language questions made over images like this. Okay, so you see examples of this in the slide. I'm kind of suggesting that these two tasks are well, seen separately, even though in the end they could contribute to a complete system handling these challenges. So nowadays, these problems are typically handled with approaches based on machine learning and neural networks. So I would say that, well, there are some previous studies and there is some work on these tasks specifically focusing on remote sensing images, but a lot of it borrows on ideas that have been presented in connection with natural ground level imageries and other types of problems. Okay, so I would even go on to say that perhaps in this specific domain of applying these techniques to remote sensing imageries, we are still somewhat behind what is the current state of the art in general image captioning or visual question answering. And I'll later on give some reasons as towards that. So in most studies, both these tasks are modeled and handled through approaches based on neural networks. And for instance, in the case of image captioning, we typically have encoder-decoder models, okay, in which there's an encoder component, usually a convolutional neural network, that produces a representation for the contents of the input image. And then there's a decoder, typically a recurrent neural network, that generates the description for the image word by word, sequentially, one word at a time. At each step, looking at the image contents and performing a selection, we call this attention, over the different features coming from the image encoder. This is the typical architecture for addressing the image captioning task. In the case of visual question answering, most previous work has seen and simplified the task as multi-class classification. Okay, so it just has to do with understanding these multimodal contents. So what we have is typically an encoder for the image, again, a convolutional neural network. We also have an encoder for the question, usually a recurrent neural network. Both these representations for the image and textual contents are then combined, and there's a fusion module that does this combination, usually again resorting to neural attention mechanisms. And from this, we finally do a classification decision that selects the right class, that is the right answer for the image question combination. Okay, so this is nowadays the typical approach to address these problems. So in my talk here today, I'm going to be talking about these two tasks, and I'm going to be presenting some ideas that we explored in connection to them. Okay, I'll start with image captioning, then I'll also describe some ideas that we tested on the task of visual question answering. And well, at least for me, perhaps even more interesting, in the end, I'm going to talk about some of the limitations in this work, some of the problems that still exist, and well, some of the ideas that we have regarding future research in this area. Okay. So specifically on what regards image captioning, and I guess kind of summarizing also some of the stuff that I said before, we have that there's actually a lot of previous work in this specific problem. Different groups are working on this at UC Merced and in Asia, in several different places. Most previous methods are based on neural models, neural encoder-decoder models. Again, as I said, using convolutional neural networks as the encoders and recurrent neural networks as the decoders. In most previous work, the encoders are actually not specifically trained with these types of images. Okay, so lots of different people tried using pre-trained convolutional neural networks on ground level images, natural images from ImageNet. And the encoders are also typically just pre-trained for doing classification rather than object detection. So in these previous approaches, for a variety of reasons, namely for avoiding the need for having data to do object detection, the image representations, they correspond to these regular regions, regular patches, okay, of features extracted from the images, rather than bounding boxes for objects and the descriptions of these objects found in the images. Well, most previous work used relatively simple architectures following this general idea, in which the changes and where most people have invested are on the attention mechanisms that select which are the parts of the images that are relevant for generating each of the words in the target caption. And there are very few previous studies that have used other types of neural encoder-decoder models that are nowadays extensively used on other tasks, specifically transformers. So transformers have seldomly been used in this task. In terms of how these previous methods are evaluated, so there are a couple of data sets that support comparisons, and most people are using these three different data sets in their experiments. So there's UCM and Sydney captions, which are a bit smaller, and then there's this larger data set, people call it remote sensing image captioning data set. And well, these were built from other existing sources. Okay, so what people did is they adapted the images associated to other data sets in which the task was to do scene classification. And so for each of these images in the pre-existing data sets, people collected captions, in some cases through crowdsourcing, in other cases through some approaches that involved first building a sort of template for the description and then varying and producing variations on this template through human post-editing. After a careful inspection of these data sets, and I nowadays know them very well, I would say that there are many limitations. There's lack of variability. There are several problems here in terms of data quality, but still, this is the benchmark that most people use to test their methods in this problem. And well, in terms of the ideas that we tested on this task, so we more or less, I guess, followed the traditional approach. But one thing that we initially did, and one thing that we tested, was to make a relatively small change in the decoder component and in how the decoder works. And what we did was that we replaced traditional decoder that generates words one by one by essentially selecting a word from a given vocabulary with an approach that instead produces continuous outputs. That is, it produces vector representations for words that you then can use to measure similarity towards an existing database of these vectors. Okay, so in a bit more detail, the traditional approach again uses, well, a typical convolutional neural network for producing an image representation, and then the decoder generates the caption word by word at each step, usually taking in the previous words that were either generated in case of decoding during test time, or the ground truth words in the caption in case of training. And at each step, what we do is we produce a probability distribution over the entire vocabulary of words. Okay, so we can train these models with the cross entropy loss regarding these probability distributions. And for doing inference, we can, for instance, take a greedy approach in which at each step, according to the generated probability distribution, we pick the word that is most likely. Or instead, we use a sort of beam search procedure to kind of avoid being greedy and taking greedy decisions. But the overall idea is this. On our continuous output models, we instead, instead of generating a probability distribution over the vocabulary, what we do is we generate vector of relatively low dimensionality. Okay, so instead of considering one separate dimension per word in the vocabulary, we are restricted to a much smaller set of dimensions. And then we take these vectors in order to search in a pre-trained embedding matrix for what is the most similar word, according to these representations, to the embedding that we generated. So word embeddings are typically used in natural language processing tasks in the encoders, right, as an approach to represent the input words that are provided to the models. They are less commonly used in the decoders, but if using them in the decoders, they bring on a set of advantages, and there are a set of different things that we can now do by taking on this approach. So I here kind of summarize some of the differences in our model and in the model that explores this, and some of the things that we can do now because of this idea of using continuous outputs. So these continuous outputs and these continuous embeddings that we use to represent word, they are pre-trained on very large amounts of data. And they are already capturing semantic similarity between words, in the sense that words that in this very large amount of texts used for pre-training appear in similar contexts, they are going to have vector representations that are also close in vector space. So if we do this, we can now also take advantage of these embeddings in order to pre-train our image encoder. And in our specific case, what we did is we took this relatively recent convolutional neural network, pre-trained on ImageNet, and then we fine-tuned it with the in-domain data and with the remote sensing images on a task that has to do with predicting, let's say, the average of the word embeddings for the captions associated to that image instead of predicting a scene class. Okay. And by doing this, we have that the image representations that are produced in the encoder are already kind of in the same space of the words that need to be generated in the decoder. Okay. So by using these vectors in the decoder, we can also use different loss functions for training the model besides the standard cross entropy. And typically we can use now functions that have to do with comparing these vectors. And in the end, we ended up using variations of these Uber loss for comparing the vectors. We see it's essentially a trade-off between the L1 and L2 losses, right? So in the sense that this behaves like L2 for relatively small values, and it behaves like L1 for larger quantities, kind of providing a robust alternative that is less sensitive to outliers. And we use this loss function for now making multiple comparisons in terms of how the generation is produced. So we end up making and computing the loss for each token that ends up being generated. That is, we compare the embedding that we generate with our model at each position against the embedding for the ground truth word that we have in the real caption. We also make these comparisons over the entire caption. So we can take the average of all the embeddings and compare these with the average of all the embeddings in the reference caption. This way, instead of forcing matches word by word, forcing instead that the overall semantics of the captions should be similar. And given that our image encoder also produces representations in the same space, we can also add to the loss function a sort of compatibility between the caption that is being generated and the image that we had as input. Okay. There's also a detail here that we haven't tested, which has to do with how these models are typically trained. And traditional models like this, they are trained using a strategy that people usually call teacher forcing, in which the idea is this. So as you are training your recurrent neural network decoder, the information that you provide to the network regarding the previous steps, the previous words that were generated, is usually taken to be the ground truth words that appear in the reference caption. So people call this teacher forcing. You kind of simulate that your model at each step is generating perfect predictions during the training of the model. So this has some problems. There are strategies that attempt to deal with this, like scheduled sampling, in which you kind of, with some probability, replace these ground truth words with the actual words that are being generated by the model. If using these continuous outputs, there are different strategies that can be used, based, for instance, on interpolating between the embeddings for the ground truth words in the caption and the embeddings that your model is generating. And the same also applies in terms of decoding. Instead of a regular beam search procedure for doing, well, a less greedy decoding, in which at each step you kind of evaluate what is the choice that you could make at this step that overall minimizes a given cost, you can now adapt this beam search procedure in order to consider comparisons in this continuous space as well. So, well, we tested this approach based on continuous outputs with the same data sets that people have used in this area. So over here, for instance, I'm presenting results for the largest of these data sets, namely RS ICD. And well, I'm not going to go too much into detail about the actual results here, but there are a couple of things that I want to highlight. And then after discussing the second idea, I'll come back to results. But first thing is that in terms of evaluation, people usually assess these methods in terms of metrics like blue and rouge, which essentially measure overlaps in terms of sequences of words that are common between the ground truth caption that you should have generated, that is available as annotations to your data, and the caption that you actually generate. So most of these metrics are capturing exact word matches rather than semantic compatibility between the generations and the captions, which is a problem. So there are limitations in some of these metrics. There are some newer metrics less used in the area that kind of go one step further, and instead of relying on exact word matches, they also consider this idea of semantic similarity between words when attempting to measure the matches. But yeah, so we try to use the set of metrics that is commonly used in the area in order to support comparisons with the previous state of the art. And what we noticed overall, in terms of an overall discussion about these ideas, is that actually fine-tuning the image encoder to the in-domain data helps you a lot. Okay, so in comparison towards a baseline in which the image encoder was the same efficient net model, but only pre-trained on ImageNet data, you get significant benefits from these in-domain pre-training. With the other additions, namely the continuous outputs and different loss functions that use different components using these continuous outputs, you get progressively better results. And well, the best strategy that we found, which involved automatically discovering the weights of each component in the loss function, actually got results that are, well, I wouldn't say better, but aligned with what was the state of the art at the time. All of this with a model that is relatively simple. Okay, so we didn't change how attention over the image features is made. We need nothing fancy there. It was just how the model was trained and this idea of using continuous outputs in the decoder. Okay. Later on, I'm going to be showing some examples, some qualitative examples for the results as well, kind of similar to this. So again, perhaps it's not too interesting and too important to look at the details, but keep in mind that, well, the captions that you have associated to the images in these data sets, they kind of resemble this. So these are relatively small sentences that describe the contents of the images. And again, there are limitations in the evaluations in the sense that sentences that are more or less capturing the same meaning but with a different word order end up being significantly penalized. And these models also make mistakes. Like often these models make mistakes that corresponds to hallucinations, that is words and objects that have nothing to do with the actual contents of the image, but somehow the model made a mistake and made up these predictions, or these repetitions, right? Because of these greedy decisions, you end up, in some cases, producing these repeated words in the generations that you do. So this was one of the first experiments that we did in the area. Later on, we tested some other ideas as well. And in subsequent work, I would say that there are two main ideas that we tested and we tried to see if through them we could improve results. Okay. So notice again that these captions are relatively small sentences. They are also, let's say, templated in the sense that different images in these datasets end up being described with relatively similar sentences. Okay. There's not much lexical variability here. And some of these has to do with problems in the datasets, but also it's, I guess, a characteristic of this domain and the types of descriptions that are interesting to produce for these images. In the end, they are more or less similar in between them, and they end up following more or less the same templates. And with basis on this, one possibility for perhaps trying to improve captioning would be to see the problem in a way that is slightly different. And rather than trying to condition the generation of the caption just on the image contents, if we actually have examples of captions taken from similar images, for instance, we could also condition the generation on this information and see the problem more of a sort of paraphrasing of an already existing caption rather than generating from scratch a caption. Okay. So for doing this, our idea was to explore a sort of retrieval augmented generation method in which we first use the same convolutional neural network encoder to retrieve similar images in a data store, and this can be the entire set of training images. So for doing this in our method, what we did is we again fine-tuned the convolutional neural network to this domain. In this case, we used the supervised contractive training objective in order to adapt an efficient net model to this domain. Afterwards, using representations from this network, we can build a data store and we can retrieve examples from this data store. And for each training example or test example, we can use this data store and take the caption from the most similar training image to condition the generation on as well. Okay. So that was one idea, copying from existing captions rather than generating from scratch. The other idea has to do with, well, since we are copying and trying to use existing textual information, instead of training our decoder from scratch, maybe we could use and explore pre-existing models, pre-existing very large language models already pre-trained on lots of textual data in order to help in the generation. Okay. So we could do this in several different ways. One limitation would be that these pre-trained language models typically are very large, and training these entire models from scratch or fine-tuning these entire models to the in-domain data computationally can be quite demanding. So what we tried to do was to keep these pre-trained language models fixed. We don't change the values of their parameters during the training of this image captioning model. What we do instead is to take the results generated by these pre-trained language models and fuse them with a standard decoder that we trained based on a recurrent neural network. Okay. And in between, we also tested a slightly different attention mechanism in the decoder over the image contents, in which we look, essentially, we look at the image contents at different resolutions. Okay, so there's an attention mechanism here that attempts to look at the image representations at different resolutions, because this can help the generation of different segments of the target caption. So this diagram here, which is a bit complex, I guess, kind of summarizes the entire architecture of the model. As I said, so there's an input image, there's an encoder corresponding to a pre-trained convolutional neural network that actually was fine-tuned with images from this domain. And well, this encoder generates features representing the image. Okay. With basis on this feature, we can retrieve from a given repository the most similar images, and we can, for instance, take the caption or a set of captions from these most similar images. And this set of captions is going to be used to initialize an auxiliary language model corresponding to a very large pre-trained transformer. Okay. So in parallel to this auxiliary language model, we have a traditional decoder based on a recurrent neural network that, in order to generate one output at each step, attends over the image features. And there's this attention mechanism that considers, well, the text generated was far and the image contents at different resolutions. And so in the end, we take out a representation produced by this recurrent decoder. We take out the representation produced by the auxiliary language model. We combine these two representations, and there are actually different ways of trying to do this. And from these combined representation, we take a decision and we produce a probability distribution over the token vocabulary. And generation is made like this. So again, we evaluated this other approach in the same data sets that are commonly used in the area. Again, here I'm plotting and showing some of the numbers computed over the largest of these data sets. Well, the numbers are perhaps not that interesting. So again, The metrics are more or less the same. Most of these metrics are based on word matches. We could outperform simpler baselines that don't use either the specialized attention mechanism that we considered or this fusion with the pre-trained language model. And with these, we got results that are in line, perhaps a bit slightly better than the previous state of the art. Okay. But even though these numbers can look quite encouraging, there are still many limitations in terms of the captions that are generated, and also in terms of how evaluation is made for this task. And the examples that I'm showing at the bottom kind of illustrate some of these problems. Okay, so again, you see that there are images that are quite ambiguous. They could be described in many different ways. We only have a sample of these possible descriptions, right? And in many cases, we generate descriptions for the images that are kind of similar to the same meaning in the descriptions that we have in the ground truth, but because word order is different or we use slightly different words, end up being significantly penalized. And in many cases, we even have that, well, a different person, a different individual would generate very different descriptions for these images. So there are problems here in terms of how the generation is made. There are limitations in these data sets, and there are some limitations also in the actual evaluation methodology and in the metrics that people use in this task. Okay. So yeah, these are some of the ideas that we tested on what concerns remote sensing image captioning. On what concerns visual question answering, well, I would say that the previous situation is more or less the same. In this case, there's perhaps even less people working on this problem, compared at least to visual question answering over natural images. I would say the most important group working on this is the one from Devis Tuya at EPFL. He has lots of work on this task. And usually the task is simplified, okay? And people see this as a sort of toy problem in which, well, the task is modeled as multi-class classification. So in this case, you don't need to generate the answer word by word. What we do is you typically have a set of classes that can be very large, corresponding to all possible answers of interest. And the task is, given a multimodal input, an image plus a question, you need to generate and to predict the correct class, the correct answer. Okay. Most previous work also used relatively simple multimodal encoders, again, based on convolutional neural networks for representing the images and recurrent neural networks for representing the text, the questions. Again, the encoders are usually pre-trained on ImageNet and pre-trained for doing classification on ImageNet. Okay, so usually people don't rely on bounding boxes for specific objects recognized on the images. They use regular features extracted from these images. And again, there's few previous work using transformers, and people have mostly invested on how the features from the images and from the question are fused. And for doing this, they have proposed tailored and specific fusion mechanisms. And this is where most of the changes in the different proposals takes place. In terms of data sets used for evaluating these approaches, there are again some common benchmarks. So there's these high resolution and low resolution data sets available from these projects. Lots of people have been using these. These are relatively small. There's nowadays a much larger data set that was built from BERT, which is essentially a very large collection of Sentinel-2 images together with, well, aligned rasters with land coverage information. And what happened here is that most of the data sets that have been built and have been used for remote sensing visual question answering, they are built semi-automatically. Okay, so what people did was usually use data from external services like OpenStreetMap that contains information on what are the buildings that are located in specific places, what are the land coverage classes, are there particular facilities located there. And from this information, together with the images and some rules that correspond to templates, people create the questions. And then the answers came from the information that is available on OpenStreetMap. So the task is significantly simplified. the data sets that people have used to evaluate their systems are also, well, simple and have some problems. And even then, because of the task being seen as multi-class classification, in some cases, there's even an additional simplification in the sense that the actual answers that the system needs to be generated at evaluation time, people kind of reduce them to a smaller set of classes. So it's typical, for instance, to, instead of consider exact quantities as the possible answer, people put these quantities into bins. And so you just have to guess the correct bin for the quantity. Questions have to do typically with asking for the presence of particular features in which the answer is yes or no, or counting for a given number of features within an image, or guessing the land coverage class that is more common, or predicting an area. These are the types of questions that are present on these data sets. So in terms of the ideas that we tested on this task, okay, so we looked at the recent literature here, and we saw a limitation in the sense that particularly how people were modeling interactions between the image and text features was somewhat simplified. Okay, so we invested a bit on that, and we designed a model in which there are very strong encoders for, well, there's actually a very strong encoder for the image component. The question is represented through a relatively shallow approach, but then the interactions between the elements in the question and the visual features is rich and is modeled to well, a more powerful model and approach than the ones that have been considered before. Okay, so in a bit more detail, some of the characteristics in the model and method that we tested for this task. So it's relatively simple. There are not many parameters, which is good because even with smaller data sets, we can train these to achieve good quality. So the model that we used is an adaptation for something that was originally proposed for doing visual question answering on medical images, which is a task that shares many similarities. Okay, so the data sets that exist there are not that large. People cannot use image regions and instead need to use simpler features. So it's a model that worked well on medical visual question answering, a task that has many commonalities with this one and that we adapted also for this domain. Okay. In our specific case, we believe this is important. So we use visual representations taken at different stages of the convolutional neural network, corresponding then to different resolutions of the features. And these visual features, they interact with the text through a sort of transformer model. We actually use the refined version of the original transformer that people call the real former. I'm not going to go into much details here, but it's essentially a transformer that has additional shortcut connections between the layers. And in this model, we also change the activation function present in the different layers of this neural network to a more recent alternative. And in terms of how the model is trained, instead of the standard cross-entropy loss for classification, we also notice that the data set is highly imbalanced and skewed. Okay, so there are much more examples, for instance, in terms of yes or no questions than for other types of questions. And so we use the loss function that compensates this imbalancement in the data rather than the regular cross-entropy loss. So this diagram here kind of summarizes basically what I said. So it's essentially the same. So there's an image provided as inputs and a question over this image. So the image is represented through a convolutional neural network, and we take 5 different vectors, okay, as the image representations at 5 different resolutions. The text from the question is actually initially represented as an embedding, and for this we take the embedding layer from a pre-trained transformer model called BERT. So there's an initial representation for each of the tokens that make up this question, and then there's a transformer model that computes interactions between the visual features and each of the tokens in the question. Okay. So this is a relatively shallow transformer model, but still this corresponds to a richer, let's say, interaction model than the ones that have been used in previous approaches. With basis on this, we take the average of all the vectors from the representations that come out of this real former. And with these average pooling results, we then have a classification layer that computes a probability distribution over the set of classes that we have. Okay, so that's an overall view on the model. So we also made some tests on this. So we use the same data sets that are commonly used in the area. And here, so this is actually not being represented, but this on top here is results computed over low resolution data set that is relatively small. This is over the high resolution data set that is also relatively small. And this here at the bottom is over this larger data set derived from OpenEarthNet. What you see here. So we actually, with this, again, very simple model, nothing fancy here in terms of how things are represented. We got results that are a bit better than the previous state of the art in these data sets. We see here that, well, the types of questions are essentially, well, these and correspond to these classes. We have questions about the presence or absence of particular features within these images. Questions that have to do with comparisons between areas or between numbers of different features. We have questions that have to do with discriminating between rural areas and urban areas. Questions about counting the number of times you see a particular feature on the image. Besides accuracy over these different classes, we also assess an average over different classes and the overall accuracy, because the data sets are highly unbalanced. And in all these metrics, well, with these, we get results that are better than the current state of the art. You actually see accuracy values that are quite high. Okay, so this looks really, really good. Like, okay, 85% of the times you guess the correct answer in these smaller data sets. Over here on these much larger data sets, almost 80% of the times you guess the correct answer. But these metrics kind of hide a lot of the problems here. And again, there are limitations in these data sets in the sense that they are relatively simple. They were built automatically. I don't have these numbers here, but one thing that we noticed, and previous work has shown this as well, is that a model that just looks at the question without looking at the image contents whatsoever already performs quite well. And by that, I mean the overall accuracy would be 10 points, 15 points below this, but still way above 50%. And what this means is that there are a lot of patterns in terms of how questions are formulated that even just looking at them, you do quite well in terms of guessing the answer. So there's a lot to do here in terms of improving the data sets and the resources that are used for evaluation on these tasks. So I have here some additional results in terms of the experimental evaluation. So for instance, here I'm showing confusion matrices for the results over these larger data sets, essentially composed of yes or no questions or questions that have to do with guessing the type of land coverage. And I also have a confusion matrix for these smaller data set here, in which again, there are yes or no questions of different types, and then questions that have to do with guessing quantities. And what you see is that, so the data set, you can see that they are unbalanced. Okay, so yes and no questions are much more frequent than the others. There's some confusion between yes or no questions, although the models are relatively competent at guessing that, well, with basis on the question, this is the type of answer that you should produce. And then there are confusions that are natural to occur, right? So between these different classes of land coverage, different types of forest, for instance, the models have some confusion when generating the answers that have to do with this. In this slide here, I kind of illustrate again some of the images that are available on these data sets, the type of questions that we have. And together with the images and the questions, I'm showing also the ground truth, the prediction that our model is doing. In all these cases, the prediction agrees. So these are, well, hand-picked examples that correspond to things where, and situation in which the model worked. And more interestingly, I'm also showing, together with the image, a class activation map that tells us which are the regions in the image that were more informative for the actual predictions that were made for the model. And you kind of see that these models are not making always correct use of the images. They are, in some cases, attending to objects that should be informative to generating the contents. In some cases, it's a bit surprising what these guys are doing. Okay, so for instance, in this case here, the question was asking if there are commercial buildings. Well, we can see that there are some structures here that resemble buildings. The model is actually attending to these structures, so it's basically appears to be doing okay. And in the end, these structures here don't resemble the types that correspond to commercial buildings. So the prediction is again no. Okay. In this case here, it's less clear, right? So the question is about a road being present on the image or not. And for doing that, the model is attending to, well, a part here that I guess is a road that is somewhat occluded, and perhaps attending also to this part here that corresponds actually to a building that maybe has some characteristics that also resemble a road. So there's not a direct match between the visual features and the actual answers that are produced. And I would say that even for future work in the area, kind of combining these question answering models with image segmentation, so that more than just producing an answer, the models can actually show where the answer is and which are the features that supported the answer is very, very promising. So yeah, I presented some initial results and some preliminary research that we did on this task. As I said, this is still very preliminary and limited, and not just in the work that we did, but the overall community is still looking at these problems as well, as toy problems. Right? So we are still very far away from practical applications of this, even though the potential applications are very interesting. Okay. So in terms of how the community has been addressing this, it's mostly been by taking ideas from what other people are doing in other types of vision and language problems. But there are some specificities and particularities here that deserve some attention. There are things in this domain that it's very unlikely that we'll be able to do in the same way as when handling natural images. And one of these issues has to do with the fact that the current state-of-the-art models for doing visual question answering or image captioning in the general domain, they correspond to these very large transformer models trained on huge amounts of data corresponding to images aligned with textual descriptions. Okay, and this is relatively easy to collect from the web for general ground level images, much harder in this case. So scaling models like this, it's very difficult to be the solution for handling this domain. Okay. In terms of how people are assessing their results, there are, as I discussed, limitations on the evaluation metrics that are being used. Okay, and we need more people using metrics like BERT score and BLUE score that are better at these semantic matching problems. And there's lots of problems with the existing data sets. Okay, so for achieving progress in the area, I would say that one thing that we need is, well, money and effort put into creating more data sets that can support these tasks. In terms of, well, ideas for future work and challenges for future work, one thing that I say is going to be particularly important is to kind of fuse these two ideas, remote sensing, captioning and descriptions, and visual question answering into one single task. So instead of modeling visual question answering as classification, we require modeling this as a sort of open-ended generation of the answer. Okay. And if we do this, we open up possibilities in terms of what types of questions these models can answer, how depth in scope changes over this. And we also bring in the advantage of perhaps considering common models for all these different tasks that can be pre-trained with more data. Okay. So if we see visual question answering in an open-ended way, again, for this, we can also use models based on a standard common encoder-decoder structure that generate the answers word by word. And with these, we can fuse perhaps these two tasks. Another related challenge has to do with the fact that if the vision is indeed having systems that allow people to interact with something like Google Earth using natural language, then the interactions are going to be conversational, right? Rather than isolated requests and isolated questions, we're going to be seeing these requests in sequence, in which one person, after getting the answer to one question, is going to make another different question. And handling conversations is different and more challenging than handling separate individual requests, in the sense that these conversations often have co-references to previous information that was given or that was requested in the same dialogue. Okay? So we, in order to handle conversational visual question answering over this data, we require additional context, we require modeling these long conversations, we require handling these co-referential expressions appearing in the questions. But there are some ideas in terms of how to do this. Again, people are exploring these ideas in terms of vision and language problems in other domains. I would argue that improving also result explainability is going to be particularly important. So this idea of showing the answer rather than just formulating the answer in natural language is quite interesting, and this perhaps can be made by combining these models with an objective that has to do with generating the right answer, and another one that has to do with generating a segmentation mask showing which are the objects and the characteristics of the images that support the answer. And yeah, so more challenging perhaps is this idea that these vision and language models in many different domains, not just in this domain of remote sensing images, they lack still the ability to really do reasoning over the visual contents. Okay, so capturing spatial relations between the objects is quite hard, and these models often struggle to do this. Capturing how the different scenes are composed is quite hard, and these models often struggle to do this. There are different ideas in terms of how this can be made. Some of them have been tested in other domains and can hopefully be brought in also to remote sensing images into this domain. Some of these ideas have to do with building richer representations for the images that capture these spatial relations and these compositionality. Okay, so rather than just considering regular regions and representations for these regions taken out from the images, we can consider representations based on scene graphs, okay, that, well, have some advantages in the sense that these graphs can capture relations between different objects and different parts of the scene. However, these graphs usually correspond to a sort of sparse representations, and having sparse representations in the middle of neural networks is challenging. Another possibility is to scale these models, okay? So follow what's been happening in other areas as well, in general ground level image problems that have to do with vision and language. And by changing the scale and by using much larger models, hopefully increase the ability of handling these problems as well. Okay, and there are some work in terms of doing this and in terms of adapting very large models trained on millions of millions of image text pairs like CLIP, and adapting them to the remote sensing domain, not for these tasks in specific, but for doing image retrieval with basis on natural language questions. Okay. So yeah, I guess this is it. This was some of the work that I had to present here. Well, thanks again for the invitation. I guess these slides can be made available afterwards, my email address as well. And if you have questions or if you want further details about some of the stuff that I presented here, you can reach out and I'll provide you with some extra information. Okay. Thanks again.
Everyone, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. We don't have much time, but I asked to the audience if there is any questions to Bruno about this work.
I have one. May I, Bruno?
Sure.
It was a quite fascinating field, this one, and a bit far from my backyard. Maybe the question is a bit stupid, but I will do anyway. How those models, either the VQA, visual question answer, and the previous one, remote sensor captioning, will deal with uncertainty. I mean, the answer to the answer could be, I don't know, I'm not sure how many buildings in the upper part There are 3 in the bottom part of the picture. I'm not sure,
Yep.
something like that. Oh, this
okay,
kind of
so
exactly this
very,
slide. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I could use different slides here to try to provide an answer. The short answer is, well, poorly, and we need to do better. Okay, so when modeling visual question answering as classification, what you get in the end is a probability distribution over the answers.
Yeah.
So, so this tells you about uncertainty as well, right? So if this distribution here is very peaked or not, this tells you if the model is confident on the prediction that is making or not. And you can try to use this in order to figure out, is this model just giving me an answer that is likely wrong or not?
Okay.
And there's also these ideas of trying to, well, I'm trying to see here if I can find the slide. Yeah, trying to see if the information supporting the decision makes sense, right? So trying to explain the predictions of these models and show parts of the inputs that can perhaps relate to the predictions of these models is another way of trying to quantify uncertainty and see if this makes sense. But of course, all of these, well, models already give you this, right? So it's fairly easy to compute these attention masks. It's fairly easy to look at probability distributions instead of the exact answers, but putting this in a framework that is useful and figuring out how to convey this information to a user is not trivial, right?
Okay, thank you. Very nice presentation.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, if there is, I have, no, it's not actually a question, it's more than a comment. And I think it's concerning Professor Amilcar's question. I'm not either a expert in this field. I have just made some topics about this. Let's say in this way. But I was very interested on one of your future work in what concerns to the image segmentation, because I think that this will be imperative to proceed and having good results about this. And I think that this this question of uncertainty will be a paramount approach in order to get good results with the combination with the image segmentation. And I think that there are lots and lots and lots of applications on this. So,
and this goes the other way around. So
yeah,
actually I have a student now working with Devi Stuya that will likely be working on this. And it's, I think it's a very interesting way forward in this area, because if you look at this, so we should refine this a lot. So these attention masks are not enough. So together with the answer, if we could train these models, so for some types of questions where we kind of know the segmentation mask, and notice that these data sets are built automatically. So for data sets that have to do with counting the number of buildings in an image and questions like this, it's very easy to also get a segmentation mask that tells you where the buildings are, because the data was built from OpenStreetMap and things like this.
Okay.
So in some cases, you could train this model in such a way that there's a loss function that computes, well, that assesses how good the answer is, and another one that computes compatibility between a segmentation mask that you get from your visual encoder and the ground truth segmentation mask. And that's easy. And hopefully what emerges from something like this, it also works for improving segmentation, in the sense that with these, hopefully you can get a sort of unsupervised segmentation as well. Because if you do this really well, then for other words that correspond to objects for which you have no segmentation masks available and no data, probably this is going to be aligning these words with the correct segmentation regions in the images as well. And so combining this task with the segmentation is a very nice idea.
It's a very nice idea, definitely. Okay, thank you so much for your answer. And well, Bruno, thank you so much for this brilliant presentation once more.
Thank you for the invitation.
it was our pleasure for sure. Well, you will receive another email for the next session of the webinars on spatial data science soon enough. Professor Milker, I don't know if you want to say a few words by the end.
No, just thank again, Bruno, and invite the rest of people for the next seminar. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
All the
Bye-bye.
best. All the best.
Bye.
Thank you.